In front of Manhattan's elite, a millionaire laughed as a black maid dropped a tray of crystal glasses. He mocked her, betting his own son's marriage that she couldn't dance a single waltz. But when she stepped onto the floor, the truth that shook the entire city was revealed. The chandeliers of the new Thompson Tower glowed like captured stars, scattering light across marble floors so polished they mirrored every movement. 200 of Manhattan's finest stood in clusters of diamonds and tuxedos, sipping champagne that cost more than a week's rent for most of the city. Waiters in white gloves glided between them, and in one corner, a woman in a plain black uniform moved quietly, trying to be invisible. Her name was Kesha Williams, and for 3 weeks she had been working these events, clearing trays, wiping glasses, always keeping her eyes down. But on this night, there was no hiding. William Thompson III, the millionaire behind this tower, had been drinking since sunset. His voice, thick with whiskey and arrogance, carried through the hall like a trumpet. Earlier he had sneered at Kesha as she passed. "Don't let that uniform of yours dirty my company's image," he said loudly enough for the crowd around him to laugh. She kept her head down, pretending not to hear, but her hands trembled as she balanced a tray of crystal flutes filled with golden champagne. It was then that fate played its cruel trick. One heel slipped slightly on the polished marble. The tray tilted. In an instant, time seemed to slow, the glasses sliding, wobbling, and then crash. The sound was deafening. Crystal exploded across the floor like shattered ice. The room froze. Conversations died mid-sentence. Every pair of eyes turned toward the black woman kneeling among the shards, her hands already reaching desperately to gather the pieces. 100 gasps filled the air, followed by a silence so sharp it could cut. And then came the laughter. It started small from one corner, then spread like wildfire across the ballroom. Not nervous laughter, but cruel, delighted, a collective mockery disguised as amusement. Some women covered their mouths with jeweled fingers, pretending shock, but their eyes gleamed with enjoyment. The men shook their heads with smug smiles, as if watching a clown stumble in the circus. William Thompson seized the moment. He raised his glass high, wobbling slightly as he stood, and let his words boom over the crowd. "This glass," he said, pointing to the one in his hand, "is worth more than her entire life's wages." The laughter doubled. His son, Jonathan, standing nearby in his tailored suit, flushed with embarrassment. "Dad, that's enough," he whispered urgently, but William brushed him aside with a drunken wave. He stepped closer to Kesha, who was still on her knees, her dark hands picking up the glittering shards that had once been flawless crystal. "Look at her," he said, his voice dripping with contempt. "This is what happens when you let people like that inside places like this. They don't belong among us. They break things they can't afford to touch." The humiliation was complete. The orchestra in the corner shifted uneasily, the violinists lowering their bows, as if music itself had been silenced by cruelty. Kesha's hair fell forward as she bent, but behind the curtain of curls, her eyes flickered with something no one in that room could quite name. It was not fear, it was not shame. For a heartbeat too brief to notice, it was something calmer, deeper, as if she were weighing every word that had just been thrown at her. William leaned closer, his breath heavy with alcohol, savoring the spectacle he had created. "Pick it all up," he ordered, his tone theatrical, inviting the crowd to enjoy the command. "And when you're done, remember, you'll never hold anything in your hands that isn't meant to serve someone above you." The crowd laughed again, convinced they were witnessing nothing more than the clumsy downfall of a maid. They didn't know that this was only the surface of a story, that the woman on the floor had once stood where applause shook the rafters, that she carried in her bones a rhythm stronger than their ridicule. But for now, all they saw was a servant on her knees, and all they heard was the echo of William Thompson's cruel laughter, filling the hall like a victory march. William Thompson did not stop at a cruel remark. Drunk on whiskey and power, he strode into the center of the marble hall as if it were his courtroom, his empire, and every guest merely a witness to his performance. He raised both arms, commanding silence, though the smirk on his lips betrayed the theater he was about to stage. "Ladies and gentlemen," he boomed, his voice echoing against the vaulted ceiling, "shall we test the talents of our dear employee?" Words carried mockery wrapped in false civility. He pointed toward Kesha, still kneeling near the broken glass, and the crowd chuckled, leaning closer as if a spectacle had been promised. Jonathan, his son, took a hurried step forward. "Dad, please, that's enough," he whispered sharply. "You're embarrassing yourself." William's eyes narrowed. "Embarrassing myself? No, son, I'm giving them a show." He turned back to the room, his glass raised in mock solemnity. "I propose a challenge. If this woman," he paused deliberately, letting the pause drip with disdain, "can dance the waltz better than my wife, then I shall marry her to my son here tonight." For a heartbeat, silence reigned. Then it hit the crowd like a spark in dry grass. Laughter erupted, rippling through the room in waves of disbelief and cruel amusement. Some men slapped their thighs, nearly spilling their drinks. Women gasped dramatically, their eyes glittering with delight at the scandalous thought. A few voices shouted over the din. "Oh, this is rich. Imagine the headlines. Put her on the floor." The orchestra players exchanged uneasy glances. Their bows and instruments hung midair, caught between obedience and conscience. Jonathan flushed crimson, his jaw clenched. "Dad, stop this," he hissed. "She's a worker, not part of your circus." William turned on him swiftly, his words sharp as a knife. "You'll hold your tongue, Jonathan, unless you want me to share with these fine people that little detail about last weekend. You know the one your girlfriend would not forgive." Jonathan froze, his mouth snapping shut, the color draining from his face. The threat hung heavy in the air, unseen by the crowd, but felt by the son whose freedom was shackled by his father's cruelty. William, satisfied, returned his attention to the audience, his arms wide. "So what do you say? Shall we let her prove herself?" The crowd roared approval, their hunger for drama outweighing their sense of decency. Already murmurs of bets began to flow. 500 on Victoria, no contest. I'll put down 1,000 she won't last a single minute. A cluster of guests crowded near the edge of the dance floor, treating the humiliation as sport. Some scribbled numbers on cocktail napkins, turning dignity into gambling chips. William's voice rose above the noise, carrying the authority of a man who believed himself untouchable. "Tonight, we separate truth from pretension. Can she move to the rhythm, or will she stumble as she did with the glasses? If she fails, she leaves here in shame. But if by some miracle she surpasses my wife, then my son shall be hers." The laughter returned, cruel and relentless, but beneath it ran a current of electricity, a dangerous anticipation. Jonathan stood stiff at the edge of the crowd, fury trapped behind clenched teeth, unable to protect the woman or himself. Kesha lifted her head slowly from the floor, her eyes meeting William's for the first time. For now she remained silent, her face unreadable. To the crowd it looked like submission. To William it looked like victory, but hidden beneath the surface was a truth no one yet saw. By speaking those words aloud, by making his mockery a public covenant, William Thompson had bound himself in front of 200 witnesses. What he believed was entertainment had just become a noose waiting to tighten around his own neck. For a long moment, the only sound in the grand hall was the faint tinkling of crystal shards being gathered by trembling hands. Kesha stayed low to the ground, her apron dusted with fragments, her breathing steady but slow. The guests leaned forward, waiting for tears, for begging, for the predictable collapse of someone cornered. William stood tall in the center, lips curled into a smirk, convinced his cruelty had broken her. But then something shifted. The movement was so slight it might have gone unnoticed had 200 pairs of eyes not been fixed on her. Kesha paused, her hands resting on the floor, and then with a deliberate calmness she pushed herself upward. Slowly, almost ceremonially, she rose to her feet. The laughter faltered. Conversations stopped mid-whisper. Even the waiters froze, their trays suspended in midair. It was as if the entire hall exhaled and forgot to breathe again. Kesha brushed the dust from her hands, straightened her back, and for the first time that evening lifted her gaze. Her eyes locked on William Thompson, unflinching, unwavering. There was no tremor in her stance, no apology on her lips. Only silence, stretched thin like a wire ready to snap. William tilted his head, amused, as though waiting for a plea. Instead, Kesha drew a long, steady breath, her chest rising and falling with a rhythm that seemed too calm for someone about to be destroyed in front of an audience. Her voice came next, low at first, but sharp enough to slice through the charged air. "I accept." The words fell like a stone into a still pond. Ripples spread instantly. The orchestra stopped tuning their instruments, bows lowering as if commanded by an unseen hand. Guests turned to one another, wide-eyed, mouths opening without sound. For the first time since the champagne had been poured that night, the crowd was robbed of its laughter. Even William blinked, confused, his smirk faltering as though he had misheard. "What did you say?" he asked, louder now, searching for confirmation. Kesha did not look away, her lips curved into the faintest smile, a smile that unsettled more than any tear could have. "I said I accept your challenge." The clarity of her words rang out beneath the chandeliers, firm enough to echo. A murmur ran through the hall. Some scoffed, whispering that she was insane. Others tilted their heads, curiosity lighting their eyes. And Jonathan, standing near the wall with fists clenched, felt something flicker inside him that he had not expected: respect. William's laughter returned, booming but hollow this time, the laugh of a man regaining balance after nearly stumbling. "So be it. he declared, raising his glass as though he had orchestrated this turn all along. The guests cheered, relieved to have the performance resume, their unease buried beneath anticipation of an even grander humiliation. Yet beneath the glitter of amusement, an undercurrent had begun to flow. For while the crowd still thought they were watching a servant walk into her own ruin, a different story had just begun. Kesha had not bowed her head. She had stood, she had spoken, and she had claimed her place in the center of the storm. What none of them realized was that the balance of power had already shifted, not with a dance, but with 3 words spoken in defiance. Victoria Thompson stepped gracefully into the center of the room, her sequin gown glittering under the chandeliers, her smile sharp as a blade. With a theatrical flourish, she extended her arms and began a series of warm-up stretches, each movement exaggerated as if she were already performing for applause. The crowd responded with polite chuckles, some even clapping prematurely, eager to flatter the wife of their wealthy host. William watched with satisfaction. Certain the outcome had been sealed before the music even began. Kesha stood at the edge of the dance floor, her hands folded, her posture still, but her eyes distant. As Victoria bent and twirled, a door in Kesha's mind swung open and the past came rushing back. She was no longer in a glittering ballroom filled with sneers. She was back beneath the blinding stage lights of the National Theatre 15 years earlier, her body draped in white silk, her heart pounding with the rhythm of the orchestra. Back then she had not been Kesha Williams, the contract maid. She had been Kesha Marrow, principal soloist of the American National Ballet, the rising star whose every leap was described by critics as defying gravity itself. She remembered the thunder of applause rolling through packed houses in New York, Paris, Milan. She remembered the standing ovations that seemed to last forever and the reviews that compared her to legends. And then she remembered the night it ended. A performance for political dignitaries, a curtain call drowned in roses, the drive home with music still in her veins, the headlights that came out of nowhere, the screech of tires, the violent twist of metal against metal, silence, then darkness. She remembered waking up 3 months later in a sterile hospital room, her legs numb, doctors gathered around her bed. Their words etched themselves into her soul. You will be lucky to walk again. Dance? Impossible. She remembered screaming without sound, the crushing weight of knowing the stage had been taken from her forever. The articles said her career was over. Some whispered she had died. For years she disappeared into obscurity, working odd jobs to survive, hiding her identity from a world that had forgotten her name. And yet through the nights of despair, she had still danced, not for an audience, but for herself. Alone in small rooms where no one could see, each movement a rebellion against the verdict of fate. The memory faded as a voice pulled her back into the present. Miss. The word was soft, almost a whisper. Kesha turned and found a man standing close, dressed in the dark uniform of security. His hair was gray, his face lined, but his eyes shone with recognition. I'm Marcus, head of security here. I worked at the National Theatre 15 years ago. He leaned in slightly, pretending to adjust the radio at his collar. I saw you then, Kesha Marrow, principal soloist. You flew across that stage like the music belonged to you. Her breath caught. For years she had concealed her name like a wound too painful to reopen. And now, in this hall filled with laughter and cruelty, someone had spoken it aloud. The papers said you never danced again, Marcus continued, his voice trembling with awe. Some said you were dead. Kesha steadied her voice though her heart pounded. The papers said many things, not all of them true. Marcus's eyes softened, filled with both sorrow and admiration. They're doing to you tonight. He glanced toward William, who was laughing boisterously with his friends. It's worse than anything the world already stole from you. Kesha straightened slightly, her calm returning like a cloak over her shoulders. Marcus, I need you to do something. When I dance tonight, no matter what happens, record the reactions, not just me, especially him. She tilted her head toward William. Marcus nodded, though confusion flickered across his face. Why? She allowed the smallest smile to break across her lips. Because some people need to be reminded that underestimating others can be the most expensive mistake of their lives. Marcus swallowed hard, understanding that he was witnessing not a maid preparing to be humiliated, but a fallen star about to decide whether to rise again. Across the room, Victoria stretched once more, tossing her hair, convinced of her victory. The guests leaned forward, eager for her performance. None of them saw the storm brewing in the quiet woman standing by the dance floor, the woman whose name once echoed through theaters, the woman they believed was nothing more than help for hire. But the truth was stirring, and when it emerged, it would shake the marble pillars of that hall. Victoria finished her routine with a delicate twirl, her sequin gown shimmering as though she were the queen of the ballroom. The movements were rehearsed, elegant in their way, but stiff, predictable, the kind of steps one learned in an expensive private class rather than on a true stage. The audience clapped politely, more out of obligation than awe. Still, William clapped louder than anyone, his grin wide, his pride swelling as though the victory had already been won. He took his wife's hand and raised it into the air like a champion's, parading her before the guests. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, his voice booming with the self-satisfaction of a man who believed the world bent to his will, "you have just seen grace itself. This is what it means to carry the Thompson name. This is refinement, poise, talent." He turned then, slowly, deliberately, to where Kesha stood waiting, her hands folded calmly in front of her apron. "And now, our entertainment. But before we begin, let's make things more interesting." The guests chuckled, already sensing another cruel twist. William spread his arms wide, addressing the hall like a ringmaster in a circus. $500 says my wife will win with ease. 1,000 if anyone is foolish enough to bet on our little maid here. Laughter erupted, cruel and eager. Guests dug into their pockets, waving money like it was a game. 500 on Victoria. One man shouted, slapping a wad of bills into William's waiting hand. "I'll take the 1,000, another sneered, but only to see her trip and fall halfway through. William pocketed the money, chuckling darkly. The spectacle was no longer about dance. It was about turning a woman's dignity into a gamble. He stepped closer to Kesha, lowering his voice but making sure enough people heard to continue the humiliation. "And when you lose, girl, I want you on your knees. Crawling across this entire floor, scrubbing every inch of it with your hands until it shines. On your knees where you belong." The laughter grew sharper, echoing like a whip across the hall. Some guests shook their heads, uneasy, glancing at one another with flickers of discomfort. But none spoke against him. Fear of William's wealth and power sealed their mouths. Jonathan stood rigid near the edge of the floor, his fists clenched. His face betrayed a war between shame and helplessness. He looked at his father, then at Kesha, then back at the floor, unable to meet her eyes. "Please," he said finally, his voice low but audible, "this is going too far." William whirled on him, his face flushed with fury. "Silence, Jonathan. You will watch and you will learn. This is the real world. There is a hierarchy and people like her need to be reminded of their place." Jonathan's protest died in his throat. He lowered his gaze, his shoulders heavy with defeat. Kesha, however, did not flinch. She did not shrink under William's words or the crowd's laughter. Her eyes were calm, almost unnervingly so, and for those who dared to look closely, there was the faintest trace of a smile at the corner of her lips. William mistook that calm for ignorance, for resignation. He turned back to the crowd, raising his glass of champagne in triumph. "Prepare yourselves," he declared, his voice dripping with arrogance. "Tonight you will see the difference between breeding and servitude, between a lady of class and a girl pretending at something she could never understand." The audience cheered, eager for the spectacle, blinded by the cruelty disguised as entertainment. But what none of them realized was that William, in his thirst for humiliation, had just written the script for his own downfall. By binding his pride and his reputation to this contest, by demanding Kesha crawl if she failed, he had handed her the weapon that could shatter his empire with a single performance. The hall dimmed, and for the first time that evening, the orchestra lifted their instruments not for background noise, but for something that carried weight. A hush spread across the ballroom like a blanket. The chandeliers glittered above, the marble floor shone beneath, and in the very center, under the sharp cone of a spotlight, stood Kesha. Her apron was plain, her shoes unremarkable, her figure modest compared to the gowns around her. But in that silence, she seemed taller than anyone in the room. The first notes of the waltz drifted through the air, slow and deliberate, carrying with them an elegance the guests expected to mock. William leaned back with a smug smile, champagne glass raised, certain he was about to enjoy the collapse of a maid who dared to challenge his family. The crowd leaned forward, eager for stumbles, ready for laughter. Kesha closed her eyes. For a moment, her chest rose with the swell of the music. And then she moved. The first steps were simple, almost timid. She glided across the floor in small arcs, her arms positioned gracefully but without fanfare, as though testing the ground beneath her. Some in the audience chuckled softly. "See, nothing special," someone whispered. Another added, "She looks nervous already." But within seconds, something subtle shifted. Her shoulders loosened, her movements stretched wider. Her body aligned with the rhythm, as if the music were flowing through her veins rather than reaching her from outside. Her feet traced the marble with precision, her arms extended with fluid grace, and the faintest murmur in the audience turned to silence. What had begun as tentative soon grew in strength. Each step blended into the next with a seamless flow that no amateur could ever conjure. When the orchestra swelled, her body answered as if she were the instrument, bending and rising, her skirt swirling in arcs of motion that painted the air. The laughter that had hovered on lips evaporated. Guests exchanged glances, their faces no longer mocking but uncertain. A woman near the front clutched her pearls without realizing it. A man lowered his glass mid-sip, staring openly. Kesha's movements grew bolder. She spun into a series of turns, her footwork crisp, her lines extended so perfectly that even the musicians found themselves playing with new intensity, instinctively recognizing the discipline of someone who had once danced on the greatest stages. Then came the moment where she broke free of the ballroom form entirely. As the melody climbed, Kesha leapt, her body lifting from the marble in a grand jeté, the kind of leap that defied gravity, that belonged not in a corporate ballroom but under theater spotlights. Gasps filled the air. William's smirk wavered, the glass in his hand trembling slightly. Victoria's painted smile cracked, her eyes narrowing in disbelief. This was no maid fumbling with borrowed steps. This was mastery disguised in humble clothes. Kesha landed softly, as if weightless, and immediately flowed into pirouettes, each spin faster, more precise, controlled by years of muscle memory carved in pain and discipline. The crowd leaned closer, mesmerized, their earlier cruelty forgotten, consumed by the revelation before them. Jonathan's mouth parted, his camera forgotten in his hand, recording but no longer for evidence, now simply to capture history. And Marcus, from his corner, recorded quietly as planned, his heart racing, whispering to himself, "She's back." The waltz built to its middle section, and with it Kesha unleashed what could only be described as defiance in motion. Every movement spoke of resilience, every line carried dignity. The audience felt it without words. The struggle of someone told she would never rise again, the defiance of someone judged unworthy, the power of someone reclaiming their place. By now the room was silent, except for the orchestra and the sound of shoes gliding over marble. Even the gamblers clutching their bets had forgotten money. Their eyes followed her, breath held, as if the floor itself might collapse under the weight of what they were seeing. Then came the climax. The music soared, and with it Kesha launched into the sequence that had once defined her career. A signature fusion of classical ballet and modern flair, steps she had invented herself. A combination so distinctive that patrons of the arts gasped in recognition. "My God," a woman whispered aloud, her voice breaking the silence. "I know that's Kesha Marrow." The name slipped into the air like a spark, and suddenly the murmurs began spreading through the crowd like fire. Kesha Marrow, the ballerina thought to be gone forever. Kesha Marrow, the legend who had disappeared after tragedy. The realization struck them all at once. The maid they had mocked was a ghost from the heights of art, returned to life before their eyes. William's face drained of color. He shook his head slightly, muttering to himself, "No, impossible." But the proof was undeniable, etched into every flawless turn, every effortless lift, every breath taken in time with the orchestra. She was not imitating greatness. She was greatness. The music raced toward its finale, and Kesha, eyes now open and blazing with calm fire, poured everything she had into the final sequence. A cascade of fouettes spun her across the floor like a force of nature, each turn sharper than the last. The chandeliers seemed to spin with her, the marble blurred, and when she finally stopped it was in her trademark pose, arms stretched, head lifted high, chest open to the heavens, a figure carved from dignity and triumph. And then silence, a silence so heavy that it pressed against the walls. Not one laugh, not one clap, not one whisper. The crowd stood frozen, their expectations shattered, their prejudices dissolved in the brilliance of what they had just witnessed. Kesha held her pose, her breathing controlled, her eyes unbroken, as if daring them to deny what they had seen. A long moment passed, then a single pair of hands began to clap. Another followed, and then the dam broke. Applause erupted, roaring through the hall with the force of thunder, shaking the chandeliers, rattling the windows. Guests rose to their feet, shouting, cheering, some with tears in their eyes. The same people who had mocked her minutes before now shouted words like "bravo" and "extraordinary." William stood motionless, his glass slipping from his hand to shatter against the floor. His empire of arrogance, built on prejudice and power, was crumbling before his eyes, undone not by force, not by wealth, but by the undeniable truth of a woman's grace. Kesha lowered her arms at last, her expression serene, almost detached, as though she had not performed for them, but for herself, reclaiming something she had lost and refusing to let it be stolen again. And in that moment, Every person in the room understood. They had not watched a maid stumble through a dance. They had witnessed the rebirth of a legend. The ballroom was no longer filled with polite applause. It had erupted into chaos, a storm of voices rising all at once. Some guests cheered wildly, unable to contain their excitement. Others whispered in disbelief, their hands covering their mouths as if they had just witnessed a ghost. The name Kesha Marrow spread like wildfire across the marble floor, whispered from one corner to another until it became a chant of recognition. In the middle of the uproar, William Thompson's face twisted with rage. His skin, once flushed from drink, now drained pale, and the smirk that had ruled the evening was gone. He slammed his hand against the back of a chair, shouting over the noise. "Enough of this nonsense. She is no one, a maid. Do not let her trick you with theatrics." His voice cracked under the weight of desperation, but no one was listening anymore. They had seen too much. The steps, the leaps, sequence only one woman on earth could perform. They knew. Marcus, standing steady at the edge of the crowd, raised his phone high. With a deliberate calm that cut through the chaos, he pressed play. William's voice filled the speakers, booming back into the hall with perfect clarity. "If she can dance better than my wife, I will marry her to my son this very night." The recording continued, capturing his laughter, his wagers, his cruel promise that she would crawl on her knees if she failed. Gasps rippled through the guests. Heads turned. Every eye swung back to William, who now stood exposed by his own words, his own arrogance immortalized in digital proof. He lunged forward, his voice hoarse. "That's not binding. I was joking. A drunken jest, nothing more." His protest fell flat against the evidence echoing from Marcus's phone and the memories etched into the crowd's minds. A woman in the front row shook her head. "No, we all heard you," she said firmly. Another added, "You insisted. You doubled the terms yourself." The tide had turned, and William was drowning in it. He turned toward his son, his voice sharp with command. "Jonathan, say something. Defend your father." Jonathan stood frozen, his eyes locked on Kesha, who remained calm at the center of the floor, her posture regal, her dignity unshaken. The young man's face betrayed years of silent obedience, years of bending under his father's control. William's threats hung in the air. But something had shifted in Jonathan too. He stepped forward, his voice trembling at first, then growing firm. "Father, you've spent your life teaching me about power, about control, about bending others to your will." His words rang out clearly, silencing even the whispers. William's eyes widened in warning, but Jonathan did not stop. "Tonight I learned something else. I learned what real strength looks like. It's not in wealth or threats. It's in dignity, it's in courage, and I learned it from her." He pointed to Kesha, his voice steady now. "From the woman you tried to humiliate." A murmur swept the crowd, admiration replacing shock. Jonathan's choice was no longer a whisper of rebellion. It was a declaration. William's composure snapped. "If you side with her, you are no son of mine. You will have nothing, no company, no inheritance, no family." His words spilled like venom, but Jonathan stood taller, the weight of his decision lifting him rather than crushing him. "Then so be it," he said, his tone calm but final. "Because I would rather have nothing than live without integrity." The words hit the room like a thunderclap. The audience gasped, some clapping already, others nodding in approval. The fall of William Thompson was no longer a possibility. It was happening in real time, before 200 witnesses, and there was no escape. William staggered backward, his hand reaching for the chair as though it could steady him. His empire had been built on fear, on money, on the silence of others. Now, with his own son's voice breaking free, that empire crumbled to dust. Kesha remained composed, her eyes steady on William, not with hatred but with something colder, pity. The hall thundered with applause again, not just for her dance, but for the justice unfolding. And in that moment, William Thompson realized he had lost everything: his pride, his word, and the loyalty of his only son. By the next morning, the ballroom scandal was no longer confined to marble walls and chandeliers. It had spilled across every screen, every feed, every corner of social media. The video Marcus recorded spread like wildfire. "Millionaire humiliated by Maid who turned out to be a legendary dancer" flashed across headlines. Clips of Kesha's performance replayed endlessly, her final pose shared millions of times, her name trending worldwide. For William Thompson, the fallout was merciless. Contracts evaporated overnight as business partners distanced themselves from his arrogance. Within days, the board of Thompson Holdings convened an emergency meeting. He was forced out, his resignation demanded not as a choice but as an ultimatum. His wife, Victoria, packed her belongings in silence, fleeing to Europe rather than endure the shame. Jonathan refused to return home, and for the first time in his life, William sat alone. His empire of fear crumbled into dust. The newspapers printed his fall on front pages. Photos captured him leaving his office in a wrinkled suit, his face gaunt, his eyes hollow. No longer the king of Manhattan's skyline, he was reduced to a man muttering excuses no one wanted to hear. But while William's life collapsed, something else was rising. Kesha, once hidden in the shadows, found herself flooded with calls, invitations, and offers. Ballet companies wanted her as a choreographer. The Lincoln Center requested a special performance. Hollywood circled with promises of biopics, yet she turned them all away. Her heart was not in glory reclaimed, but in something deeper. She accepted instead the modest gift of children she had once tutored in a community school. They had scraped together $23, shyly offering it to her as a scholarship to keep teaching. It moved her more than any contract. Within months, donations poured in from around the world, from strangers inspired by her dignity and resilience. And so the Kesha Marrow Center for the Arts was born, right in the heart of Manhattan, not far from the tower where her humiliation had begun. The first day the doors opened, sunlight streamed through wide windows onto polished wooden floors. Children of every background ran inside with wide eyes, clutching ballet shoes, notebooks, even hand-me-down sneakers. Ready to learn. In the center of the main studio, hanging on the wall, was a pair of worn ballet slippers, her own, frayed at the edges, scarred by thousands of rehearsals and that one night of tragedy. They hung not as a relic of loss, but as a beacon of survival. Kesha stood at the front of the room, her posture straight, her smile quiet but radiant. As the children mimicked her movements, stumbling through their first pliés, she saw in them the spark she had once carried, the spark that fate had tried to extinguish. Her eyes softened, and for the first time in years she felt peace. Jonathan appeared often at the center, not as an heir but as a helper. He donated the first check that helped renovate the space, but more importantly, he gave his time, carrying mirrors, painting walls, even sweeping floors alongside volunteers. When he spoke to the children, he told them the truth, that he had once been silent when cruelty roared. But he had learned that silence is as dangerous as the cruelty itself. They listened, not to the son of a millionaire, but to a man who had chosen integrity over inheritance. One evening, as the last notes of a piano rehearsal faded, Kesha sat quietly watching her students twirl clumsily, their laughter bouncing against the mirrored walls. Jonathan entered carrying flowers from the small garden he had planted outside the center. He placed them on the windowsill, their colors glowing in the fading light. He turned to her and smiled. "Ready for dinner?" he asked. She looked at the children, at the slippers on the wall, at the life she had built from ashes, and then back at him. "Ready," she answered softly. Meanwhile, somewhere far from the light, William Thompson appeared briefly in the back pages of the press. A single photograph showed him hunched at a diner counter, staring at a cold cup of coffee, a man stripped of wealth, family, and the illusion of power. His name, once synonymous with influence, was now only a cautionary tale. And so, the story ended not with his destruction, but with her creation. For Kesha's greatest revenge was not in bringing William down, but in lifting something far higher than his cruelty could ever reach. She built a legacy where children found their voices, where broken dreams learned to dance again, where dignity replaced humiliation. Her triumph was not to answer hatred with hatred, but to craft beauty so undeniable that hatred seemed small, irrelevant, forgotten. And as the world watched, inspired by her journey, one truth became clear. Sometimes victory is not measured by what you take from your enemies, but by what you give to those who come after you. If you enjoyed this story, let us know in the comments. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more inspiring stories.